Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
A new year approaches, as does a new president and perhaps a new start. We'll find out what all that means on today's edition of Liberty Nation Radio. Donald Trump approaches the White House. It's not going to be long as we enter 2025. What is going to happen between now and January 20th? Well, we're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for being here, Tim. Merry Christmas to you and a Happy New Year.
You as well. And I'm not going to say a happy holidays. We need to banish that phrase.
I agree completely. Whenever anybody asks, I say, what holiday is that then?
Well, it was Donald Trump that said he's going to bring back Merry Christmas when he was first elected. And in fact, he did that, didn't he?
He did, although I have seen footage of Kamala Harris saying something along the lines of channeling Greta Thunberg, along the lines of, how dare we say Merry Christmas? And then, of course, it does the supercut to her saying,
look,
Merry Christmas.
I try to, with most people, say Merry Christmas and Happy Kwanzaa, because that covers the whole waterfront. You know, nobody can be upset that.
Absolutely. Although you are missing out on Hanukkah. So never forget that one.
Well, I usually put in Hanukkah too, but usually only when the person I'm speaking to is Jewish.
Right. Hey, I thought this was the melting pot. Surely cultural appropriation is cultural appreciation if we're all celebrating everybody's cultural artifact. So anyway, let's get back to the topic at hand, Tim. We're fast approaching the inauguration of the once and future president, Donald J. Trump. But to me, it seems that this period, essentially while Joe Biden is winding things up, the transition's running apace, what do you think we'll see between now and January 20th when Donald Trump's inaugurated?
Well, Mark, I've never seen in all my years, and I've followed politics closely since the 1960s, and this is backed up by others who've covered politics professionally through the years. We've never seen a president-elect who was as visible, as active, and engaged as Donald Trump is. John F. Kennedy, for example, that was a seminal election, sort of the signaling of a new era. Ronald Reagan, another very significant presidency. Both of those guys, when they were elected, basically disappeared between Election Day and January 20th. But Donald Trump is acting and behaving as if he's already president. And part of that, of course, is the weakness of Joe Biden and his seeming incapacity to do much of anything except show up in an awards banquet at the Kennedy Center in Washington, or go to Africa, or make a statement and then walk back into the forest, as he famously did a couple of weeks ago. So I think Biden's weakness and his frailty and his obvious cognitive decline, compared with Trump's really his anxiety about getting going quickly, because he knows this time he for sure only has 4 years. So I've never seen anything like it. He's already held significant meetings with foreign leaders, as we know. He was threatening tariffs against both Mexico and Canada. And Justin Trudeau,
the governor of the soon-to-be 51st
state, Justin Trudeau, the governor of the state of Canada, beat a hasty path to Mar-a-Lago in Florida to beg Trump not to institute the 25% tariff, which Trump is threatening. And I think it's clear that he doesn't want to lay a 25% tariff on either Canada or Mexico. but he's using it as a negotiating tool, and he's proven that he will follow through if he is forced to. So, especially on the foreign stage, and of course, he went to the opening of Notre Dame, the reopening of Notre Dame after that tragic fire in Paris years ago. And Joe Biden wasn't there. And Jill Biden was, and by all accounts, and you can see it in the pictures, Trump and Dr. Jill got along famously, leading, of course, to the speculation, together with the fact that Dr. Jill wore a red pantsuit on the day she voted on Election Day, sparked speculation that the Bidens actually voted for Trump rather than Harris, or at least wanted to sort of tease people into thinking they did. So this is the most active president-elect we've ever seen, and it's not even close.
Yeah, Donald Trump, he has this almost unnatural energy about him, and it's something that he's actually had from when
He's
he
a force
first
of
came onto the
nature.
public stage. Yeah,
I mean, he's a force of nature. He doesn't look a day older than when he was running in 2016. He has the same level of energy and the same level of passion and the same absolute willingness and plans for really shaking things up this time.
I tell you what is different. He actually has more experience of being president this time.
Big difference.
That's going to be a valuable thing. Now, I want to come back to something you said earlier about how much of Trump's energy and actions during this time could be, well, at least part of it could be put on the shoulders of Joe Biden, essentially checking out and just doing those three things that you mentioned, the walk off into the forest. I have no idea where he was going, maybe to contact some uncontacted
The point is
tribes.
that he didn't either.
Yeah. But I think it really puts something to the fore, and that's the idea that although the United States has had congressional shutdowns before, I mean, it's almost a semi-regular thing now.
Yes.
It's never had an executive shutdown. And I think with Joe Biden essentially wandering off into the sunset, as he's politically doing, and possibly even personally, it's left a power vacuum at the executive level. And that demands that somebody step into it, because you can't have a ship without a captain, right? And so Donald Trump stepped into that, and people have realized this, and therefore all the forces are sort of coalescing around him. He did a great piece for the pages of LibertyNation.com, the sponsor of this show, that was talking about the Mar-a-Lago White House and how things are all coalescing in Florida, because people go where the power is, don't they?
They do. And you're right about a power vacuum. And Donald Trump is clearly filling it. And there don't seem to be any objections from the Biden administration. Let's face it, once Joe Biden pulled out of the presidential race, the big question following it was not so much would Kamala Harris pick up the mantle, because he made sure that she would by endorsing her in the same statement that he released about him withdrawing from the race. The question was, if he can't run for another term, why is he still qualified to continue as president of the United States? And that question remains to this day. I mean, there's been a total absence of leadership of even, Biden just hasn't been present or accounted for. And people rightly wonder who's really steering the ship, who's running the show, who's in charge. And given that Joe Biden still has control of the nuclear codes, this is a question of grave importance. But with Donald Trump stepping in, I think people across the world, especially foreign leaders, realize that the person whose ring they need to kiss right now is Donald Trump, not Joe Biden. And Trump willingly does it. And he's far more confident, sure of himself, on steadier footing than he was the first time that he was elected. And his cabinet, and the contrast to his cabinet in the first term, is the best reflection of that change, and the fact that Donald Trump, as we say, knows where the bodies are buried this time.
We'll be continuing this exhumation after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by Tim Donner. Thanks for sticking around, Tim. So earlier in the show, we were talking about the run-up to inauguration. Now, I think that everybody is almost fascinated in almost like a train wreck thing, where you can't tear your eyes away about what that first day in office will entail after the ceremony, the inaugural ceremony. What signs, what hints, what statements have we had about Donald Trump's first day in office and perhaps his 100 days leading out?
Well, I think the thing that stands out the most is the promise to seal the border. And for Tom Homan, the designee for border czar, although that's not a cabinet position, so you can just appoint him to that. It doesn't require Senate approval. The plans are already obviously well in place to round up the illegal immigrants who have committed crimes, and that means crimes not just in this country, but who have documented crimes committed in their country of origin. And I think that's going to be unleashed at about 12:01 on January 20th, right after Trump puts his hand on the Bible and takes the presidential oath of office. Seal the border and start the process of rounding up the dangerous illegal immigrants who have, terrified the American citizens across the country. He's going to unleash drilling and fracking to a degree that we've never seen before, because, as Trump rightly points out, the reason our cost of living is so high all relates back to energy. People think, well, energy just relates to the price of gas at the pump or how much it costs to heat my home. But in fact, if you look at the supply chain, where goods go through 5 or 6 different middlemen before they get to the consumer, it requires energy at every step along the way. So he's right to say the way he's going to bring down the cost of living is to unleash drilling, which he calls drill, baby, drill on day one. And that's, by the way, the one day that he said he would be a dictator. And he said he'll close the border and drill, baby, drill. And he'll also open up fracking to a degree that we've never seen before, fracking on federal lands. And all of this is going to contribute to a lower cost of living. He's going to reverse, probably dozens of Biden executive orders, some of which he's doing in these final days to make things difficult for Trump. So he's going to reverse probably dozens of executive orders, as he did when he came to office in 2017. And I think the most intriguing question of all is pardoning the January 6th so-called insurrectionists, those who are sitting in the D.C. jail right now. And there's over 800 of them who have been convicted of crimes related to January 6th. He has promised to pardon all of them. Will he do it on day one? Will it be a blanket pardon? Will it just be for those who walked through an open door, as opposed to people like the Proud Boys, who instigated the riot, broke windows, attacked police, and seized offices? That's a big question. Whether he does that on day one, I'm not certain, but there'll be a lot of attention focused on that.
My supposition would be that it would have to be a case-by-case basis. Essentially, but there's a great way to sort this out if you have an Excel spreadsheet, isn't there? You look at who's being charged with what, and if it's criminal trespass, I think is that right? All the ones who are just in the criminal trespass column, they're pardoned, and then obviously dig deeper into it. I think it's pretty fascinating that earlier in the show you were talking about the imposition of tariffs and the combined with what you said here about closing the border on day one, and I think a lot of people don't really realize that the tariffs are not there to offset the cost. The tariffs are there to force cooperation with the incoming administration's policy agenda, and they're designed to be more painful to the countries that aren't falling in line with America's policy agenda than they are for Americans. And people don't really realize that at least I don't want to say people, because people in general are pretty great at figuring things out. But the main messaging that's coming across in the let's call it the more left-leaning legacy media is that it's Americans who are going to get hurt by these tariffs, and they don't seem to acknowledge that the tariffs are a tool to gain compliance with the America First agenda. Why do you think that's being obfuscated?
Well, because, we've been told for a long time, and with good reason, I suppose, by the likes of the Wall Street Journal and free market economists, that tariffs will cost the American people. And to a degree, they're right.
Yeah.
Because a tariff increases the cost of goods coming over the border, and that's a cost increase that's passed on to the American consumer. However, the point of tariffs, beyond it as a negotiating tactic for Donald Trump, is to protect American jobs. And the question ultimately becomes, would you give up lower prices in return for creating more American jobs that are not going to get shipped overseas? There's also this sense of revisionist history that's been going on for a long time about tariffs. When Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury back in the early days of the Republic, was trying to figure out how to create something close to a full employment economy, he employed tariffs to prevent foreign powers from overwhelming the American continent with goods. And therefore, he was protecting American jobs. And that was Alexander Hamilton. And that takes you all the way back. And that's ultimately, I think, in addition to being a negotiating tactic, that is what Donald Trump's main priority is. He doesn't want goods sold to Americans being made in Mexico or China or elsewhere. He wants those goods to be made here. He wants those jobs to be here. And that's the main purpose of his tariff regime.
Yeah, and as you said, if that combined with the drill baby drill manifesto pledges, as it were, the actual cost of production of whatever goods are then produced in the United States will actually be a lot more competitive, because obviously it's a third of the cost of everything is basically energy. We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Tim Donner, and I remain your host, Mark Angelides. We've been talking the road to inauguration. We've been talking Trump day one and beyond. But one thing is as sure as eggs or death and taxes, if you like, Tim, is that there's going to be resistance to almost whatever policy Donald Trump puts forward. If he puts forward a proclamation saying we must acknowledge that grass is green, there'll be resistance to it. That is as sure as anything else you can rely on. But I'm wondering if the Democratic Party, the big names in the Democratic Party, their activists and their allies within the legacy media, whether they have a coherent enough strategy to be an effective resistance against Donald Trump.
Well, I think the answer to that is no. And for a simple reason, there is a total vacuum of leadership in the Democratic Party. Who's the leader of the party right now? Joe Biden is leaving the White House.
Don
Kamala,
Jr.
well, but look, Biden's leaving the White
Mm.
House. Kamala Harris is going to go back to California. Maybe she'll run for governor. Nobody sees her as a de facto leader of the Democratic Party. Nancy Pelosi is 84 years old and remarkably running for Congress again. But she's pretty much been brought low by her role in stabbing Joe Biden in the back and forcing him out, even though she also didn't want Kamala Harris to be the nominee because she felt rightfully that Kamala Harris was not up to it. She was not presidential timber. Chuck Schumer's no longer the majority leader in the Senate, so he's going to have to settle for being minority leader with a 6-seat deficit for Democrats in the upper chamber. You might call it 3 seats, but it's 53-47 now, as opposed to having a narrow majority, which Chuck Schumer had for the last couple of years. And in the House, the Republicans have the very same razor-thin majority, but that means that Hakeem Jeffries, the House leader of the Democrats, doesn't have a whole lot of juice either. So I don't know how you can organize resistance when you don't have anybody leading that resistance. I mean, it seems that it's just the media and left-wing publications and the likes of the New York Times and Washington Post and left-wing sites like The Nation and Slate and The Atlantic who are trying to sort of take the lead in the resistance. And it's very hard to diffuse a resistance in so many different directions to so many different sources. So I'd say they're in big trouble in terms of resistance because they don't have a disputed election. They didn't win the popular vote. They got their clocks cleaned in the Electoral College to a point that there wasn't even any violence after the election, which everybody expected in D.C. Most shop owners boarded up their storefronts in anticipation of violence, which never came because the result was so decisive for Trump. And that creates a much bigger problem, too, because people know, unlike in 2016, they know what Trump is all about. They can't make the claims that he's going to be a dictator because he wasn't when he was in the White House before. So the resistance is going to be very difficult, particularly in the early stages. You know, a president always gets a honeymoon of 3 months, 6 months, something like that. And Trump's honeymoon is going to be a lavish one, I suspect, because of the inability of Democrats to do anything except whine and complain. They don't have any power to do much of anything about it.
You wrote a fascinating article on how Trump has essentially ended 4 political dynasties. And I want to bring that up now. It's on the pages of libertynation.com. Do go and read it. It's a fantastic piece, listeners. You mentioned that he essentially also brought low the Obamas. Now, Barack Obama and to some degree even Michelle have been leaders
of the
resistance for quite a long period of time, whether that was in the White House or out. Many people even said Joe Biden's presidency was a continuation of, it was Barack's third term. And if Kamala had won, it would have been Barack's 4th term, essentially, or at least the term of that
yes,
political ideology.
Of progressive ideology, yes.
But it's been brought low. The Obamas have been brought low by Donald Trump. So even they are not in a position to really take up the mantle because their ideology, their progressive movement was rejected, as you say, so resoundingly that not a single swing state went to Kamala Harris. And I wonder then who will be leading or riling up the activist groups that have been so effective since the summer of George Floyd, with nobody to really direct them about this is what we're after. And I just briefly want to bring in here the Daniel Penny trial, with Daniel Penny being found not guilty. And you had, I believe it's Hank Newsom of the New York BLM chapter.
Hawk Newsom, yeah.
Hawk Newsom, sorry.
And his sidekick, the woman, his sidekick. Yeah.
And they were calling for black vigilantism because what? Because a diverse jury in Manhattan found somebody not guilty of a crime. But it fell on deaf ears. Nobody took up to the streets. Nobody went marching. Nobody went rioting. It was largely ignored by the media, probably because he was somewhat inciting in what he was saying. And so what about all these activist groups? They're just going to melt away into the woodwork or down the drains?
Well, I think that Hawk Newsom and I guess you could call the final breath of the Black Lives Matter movement actually makes it harder for the resistance, because Hawk Newsom goes out there after the Daniel Penny verdict and basically says that, as you said, we need black vigilantes to go after white people, presumably indiscriminately. And this has been the whole problem with the Black Lives Matter movement to begin with, is that they put their reputation on the line in support of criminals. Daniel Penny, the man who was killed by Daniel Penny, had committed more than 40 or had been arrested more than 40 times. This guy was a hardened criminal. And yet Black Lives Matter chooses him to be the focus of their protestations to the verdict, which was men and women, blacks and whites in the jury. I mean, it was clear that it was it seemed to be a just verdict, even according to the mayor of New York, who Eric Adams put his fingers on the scale when he said, I think most people would want a Daniel Penny on the subway car when they're being attacked. So this is the dying embers, shall we say, of a movement that has done its best to destroy the country ever since the George Floyd affair. And again, in the case of George Floyd, just like with Hands Up, Don't Shoot, George Floyd was a criminal. He had a long criminal record, and yet Black Lives Matter was formed it had been formed previously, but it came to prominence and success after the George Floyd incident. Nobody bothered to notice that George Floyd was a man who had committed several criminal offenses in his life. If I'm a person of the left, I'm saying to Hawk Newsom and BLM, shut up. Don't go out there and make claims that everybody can look at and say, talk about racism. This is unmitigated, open, proud racism. And I think it's symbolic of the end of an era that most Americans would really like to forget, bending the knee to cultural Marxism and a Black Lives Matter movement that accumulated $90 million in contributions after the George Floyd affair, and then a couple years later filed for bankruptcy. That says it all.
It does indeed. We're going to be back talking the future legacy of the Democratic Party after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. We continue to be joined by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and long-time host of this here radio show, Tim Donner. Now, Tim, I think we've really run the whole gauntlet on this. We've talked about the pre-inauguration period. We've talked the first day and the first 100 days of Donald Trump in office. We've talked the Democrat resistance and how that, I think we both agree, has failed to form and can't really form until somebody steps into a leadership role there. But now what I'd like to talk about is the potential wilderness years that Democrats are facing. Because we talk a lot about what's happening with the Democratic Party right now, but I suspect, and please tell me your thoughts on this. I suspect that the Democratic Party might be out of power for at least 8 years, if not 12, because they don't have, as far as I can tell, they don't have an ideology behind them or a driving force or a raison d'etre to really grip onto.
Well, I think we see it as we look back over presidential history that every election is essentially a reaction to the last presidency. For example, Woodrow Wilson, let's just go back to the start of the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson, at the end of 8 years, was out of gas, and the country was not pleased that he forced us into World War I. We could argue whether that was a move he had to make or not, but the response to that was 12 years of Republican presidents. When the Depression hit, Franklin Delano Roosevelt reversed that Republican string of victories and won 4 straight himself, and then Harry Truman made it 5. As a response to the Great Depression, people did not trust Republicans anymore. And, likewise, at the end of 12 years of Reagan and Bush, people were just kind of exhausted of the conservatism that had been strong during the Reagan administration. And then George H.W. Bush came in and called for a kinder, gentler nation, which meant that he was going to put the brakes on the hardcore conservatism of Ronald Reagan. Likewise, this election was a reaction to 12 of the last 16 years of progressive democratic rule. And most times when a philosophy such as progressivism has been discredited or even disgraced, it takes more than one election for that party to recover, which means I'd be surprised if the Democrats were able to win in 2028 unless they're able to completely renounce the philosophy that has basically animated the 12 years of the Obama and Biden presidencies. So I agree with you. They could spend a lot of time in the wilderness. But a note of caution is that, in 1972, the Democrats had gone so far left, George McGovern lost 49 states to Richard Nixon, but they were able to turn back, and we've discussed this before, by going to the center with Jimmy Carter, who won 4 years later. Same thing with Bill Clinton, who came to the rescue of the Democratic Party after the disaster of left-wing Michael Dukakis's candidacy in 1988. So it is possible, but the Democrats are somebody said that the Democrats have to throw progressives under the bus. But the problem is that the progressives are the bus. And so it's going to take a long time to turn this Titanic ship around. And they have to hope that they have to invest in someone like Pennsylvania's more moderate Governor Josh Shapiro and put all their chips in behind him, or another moderate like Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky, if they want to be competitive in 2028. And let's not forget that Donald Trump is going to anger an awful lot of people in the years ahead. He intends to, because he truly wants to empty the swamp and destroy the administrative state to the extent that he can. So he's going to create even more enemies. And you just don't know come 2028 whether people will be exhausted of drastic reforms. That, combined with a moderate candidate like a Josh Shapiro, could give Democrats a chance in 2028. But if they insist on saying it's not progressivism that cost them this election, or that, handed a victory to Donald Trump when no one thought he could make a comeback after January 6th and the end of his administration. Then they're headed for a long run, 40 days on the backside of the desert, so to speak.
Yes, I think
40 years on the
40
backside
years,
of the desert. Yes.
I think that's probably the right analysis on this, that they need to shift to somebody who is a more moderate, like a Bill Clinton type, for example.
Yes.
But regards to the lessons that they've learned, will they jettison progressivism? All of the noise we're hearing now, and still hearing, except from a very few quiet corners, is that Kamala Harris lost because A, she only had 100 days. B, she's black. C, she's a woman. Those are the three main
Or
excuses we're hearing.
even D, that she was just a bad candidate and it's not representative of the party as a whole.
That is the least one that we're hearing, is that she was a bad candidate, although it does pop up. But nobody's saying, very few people in a position to shape policy or the future direction of the Democratic Party are saying it's because of this ideology that has infected one of America's two great parties. Nobody seems to be willing to say that. And I think until they do, people like Andy Bashir, people like Josh Shapiro are going to be out in the wilderness, because they're not going to get the
Joy
support.
Reid, people like Joy Reid and the ladies of The View, and people like Senator Claire McCaskill, former senator, who's a prominent commentator on CNN. What they've done is they've turned from calling Trump supporters garbage and deplorable and irredeemable to basically attacking the American people writ large, to say, I didn't think we lived in a country with so many people. Obviously, Donald Trump understands the country more than we do. We didn't believe that the country as a whole was so misogynistic and racist, and you had Al Sharpton attacking black men for being misogynist. Whoever thought that we'd see that day?
Yeah, it's I mean, I'm wondering if Al Sharpton is this was Al Sharpton's last big hurrah. I mean, he's out of favor now, even with his friends over at MSNBC, for accepting was it $500,000 donation to his foundation before interviewing Kamala. So I think this might be the last election that we have a powerful voice from the Reverend Al Sharpton, and as far as I'm concerned, Tim, that's quite a good thing.
Well, I mean, it's if you think about it, given its race hustling and all the devastation that he's left in his wake over the years, with his anti-Semitic diatribes and all the stuff, that the false accusations, Tawana Brawley and the rest, it's hard to believe that guy still has any credibility. But he's a prominent voice on MSNBC. And it's every time that I'm forced to watch MSNBC for professional purposes and they go to Al Sharpton, I just laugh. I'm like, really? Who in this country is left believing that Al Sharpton is a legitimate voice for anybody or anything?
And on that note, Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Great pleasure, Mark, as always.
And that's all we have time for on today's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Antelides. I'd like to thank our guest, Tim Donner, and extend the very merriest of Christmases and Happy New Year's to you, the listeners at home, for joining us. And remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse campaigns, candidates, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.